the very best whiskey. There is a catastrophic gap between promises to cut carbon emissions and the action needed to deliver those cuts. That's the verdict today from the United Nations. A new UN report says reductions pledged in the Paris Agreement in 2015 amount to just a third of what's needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. It's calling on governments and the private sector to do more to bridge the gap. Just yesterday, the World Meteorological Organization said that concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere had reached a record high. Tom Burke is a former advisor on energy policy to the British government. I asked if he thought catastrophic was the right word to use to describe current global efforts to tackle climate change.
It's the right word. If we don't close that gap, then it will be a catastrophe, and it will be a catastrophe for everybody on the planet, and it will make business, as of all kinds, impossible to attract investors or to find markets.
What's going wrong? What's the problem here, then?
Well, the problem is climate change. There's not anything going wrong that we didn't anticipate. So when Paris came out, it was well understood that though it put us on the right road, it wasn't going to take us far enough down the road, and it wasn't going to do it fast enough. And this report has confirmed that judgment. And we've seen some of those flashing red lights coming up in other areas recently. We've seen it with extreme weather events. We saw it with the report that came out just earlier last few days about the impacts on health. We're starting to see that the climate is changing faster and more dramatically than we anticipated.
And this report seems to be, this latest UN report, pointing the finger at developing countries' plans for coal-fired power stations. This is one reason why things could be a lot worse than we thought.
I think that's right. I think that we've really got to move out of coal extremely fast. And by and large, the OECD countries are already doing that, and China is beginning to do that. But there's quite a lot of proposals to build more coal-fired power stations in developing countries. Now, actually, that's probably not going to be the best way economically to solve the problem you have in a lot of developing countries, which is large populations that don't have electricity. What's now become clear, because the costs of renewables have gone down so fast, is that it's probably going to be much better to get, particularly to rural populations, to get electricity to them to invest in deploying renewables. And we've seen India shift its emphasis from talking about coal to talking about renewables. I think that needs to become more widely accepted around the developing countries.
Yeah, so the sort of thing needs to be done more quickly. What practically then could be done? I mean, this report also says cost-effective options are available that can help close this so-called catastrophic gap between action and consequence. Like what, for example?
Well, what we're seeing already, renewables, basically solar and wind, are now beginning to compete even with gas. Without subsidy, because the costs are coming down in many parts of the world really fast. I think we're going to see the same thing happening with vehicles, because battery costs are coming down. Where I think we've got to make really much more progress is with buildings, and they're absolutely right, the report, to say that there are an enormous number of cost-effective things we could do to reduce the emissions from buildings. But the bit that people have not begun to focus on anything like enough are emissions from agriculture, and we really need to do a lot more.
And what's the role of business here in being proactive, not waiting for governments?
90% of the businesses in the stock market don't emit much of any kind of emissions. Their emissions aren't the problem. The emissions that are the problem are those that come from the fossil fuel industries and their primary customers, the power industry, the motor industry. And in effect, what's happening to the bulk of the businesses, if we don't deal with this, it's the fossil fuel industries are eating their lunch, because the non-fossil fuel industries, the bulk of the stock exchange, they don't suffer from a successful climate policy. Whereas if you constrain the use of carbon and therefore solve the climate problem, then you do hit the oil and gas industries, you hit the motor industry, you hit the very energy-intensive industries. But that's a very small part of the stock exchange. So most businesses have a lot to gain from the successful policy in closing that gap, and much to lose if we don't close it.
So what more should they now be doing?
Fossil fuel businesses, they need to get out of fossil fuels fast. Companies, the Shells, the BPs, the Exxons need to do is join in the energy transition a lot more aggressively than they're currently doing. The non-fossil fuel businesses, they need to get government to act much more quickly, because if they don't put pressure on government, they'll find that that gap goes on, we get catastrophic climate change, and their business gets hurt.
That's the former British government advisor Tom Burke. He's now chairman of an environmental think tank called E3G.